Looks like it's about 3:20, so we can go ahead and get started. For those of you still coming in, it looks like there's maybe a few more seats over here on the right-hand side. I'm honestly shocked this is as popular as it is. If anything, I think Loinkin Smart needs our help more. But happy to have you all here today, and thank you for coming. My name is Janet Campbell, and as I've been watching these sessions, I notice a lot of people do start out with their biography. So for the latecomers, so you don't have to sit through it again, I'll go ahead and get that out of the way. My background is in software development, and I work at Epic. I've been there about 16 years. Over that time, I've worked in the clinical applications, the billing applications, and patient engagement. And it was really through patient engagement that I got my introduction to the standards community. I also worked to represent Epic in Argonaut at the steering committee. But you're not here to hear about me, hopefully. You are here to hear about smart web messaging. And if we had to sum up what smart web messaging is in a single sentence, or actually a single sentence fragment, this would be it. Smart web messaging provides tighter workflow integration for smart embedded applications in an EHR. Now, what that means is that smart web embedding generally, if I had to sum it up, it gives almost the ability for two applications to act as one. It allows an EHR to host a smart embedded application and to give the provider an experience as if it was a single application. Now, that sort of works, but in order for that to work really well, we need to be able to have a tighter integration than just hosting the application in the first place. And that's what smart web messaging gives us. So I'm going to start off with an example. It's kind of a made-up example, but definitely systems like this exist. Let's say I'm a doctor, Dr. Gray, and I have a patient in front of me, and I'm about to order an expensive imaging procedure. Now, certainly I want to make sure that my patient is getting the right procedure for the condition that she's experiencing. I also want to make sure that we're spending money efficiently, that we're not getting imaging that doesn't make sense, and I want to minimize her radiation exposure. So generally, I want this to be a, well, pun intended, smart decision. Typically, a lot of those rules aren't necessarily just built into an EHR. So ideally, I would integrate with a system. I've called it RAD CDS here because I'm not super creative with names. But I would integrate with a system that could take information about the order that I'm suggesting, that I'm about to place, as well as other patient information, and come back with a recommendation. And that recommendation might be to keep the order, and here's an appropriateness score that's associated with it, or perhaps to substitute out an order. It might even be an opportunity for the application to ask me, the clinician, Dr. Gray, for more information in order to make its decision. Now, there's a reason why this is important. And just as a side note, if a software developer asks you why you want to do something, that's actually possibly because she wants to understand the use case so that she can code for it appropriately. But if it helps to think of her as evil and toxic to match your narrative, that works as well. In this case, the reason why this is important is because in 2014, PAMA was passed, the Protecting Access to Medicare Act. And specifically, what PAMA said was that by this date, it turns out it's going to be effective, January 2021, Dr. Gray has to consult one of those external qualified sources to check the appropriateness of the procedure that she's ordering. Specifically, PAMA says that those clinical appropriateness scores need to be recorded back in the EHR. And by January 1st, 2021, CMS will stop paying for imaging procedures that don't have that clinical appropriateness score associated with it. In fact, this is required starting in 2020, but it's not going to be enforced until 2021. Now, as we mentioned, this was passed in 2014, so we've had a pretty long runway to work on it. And in fact, it's such a reasonable use case that we've had support in this from Epic's perspective for quite some time. But there was a problem with this. Specifically, that decision spec that we see right there, integrating external decision support with Epic, that was actually only used by one vendor. Very good vendor. They went and built another custom integration with Allscripts. I think they did the same thing with Cerner as well, but it was still just that one vendor. And given that this is going to be required for every clinician out there, having only one vendor that can integrate with an EHR is just not an economically sound model. We want to be able to level this playing field so that organizations can take their pick among all of the different CDS vendors out there and plug and play this external clinical decision support within the workflow. Now, with a smart application, in this case, smart applications are good because they can be launched at various points within a workflow, and you can even be very clever about how you do that. You could launch a smart application at the point where Dr. Gray is writing that, order. They also can use RESTful APIs for simple create, read, update, delete type of operations. You all know this being here at the FHIR conference. Unfortunately, smart applications themselves, at least within the basic smart spec, don't have a really good way of interrogating in-process documentation. So remember in that example, I'm Dr. Gray, I go to write in an order. I haven't signed it yet, but I want to get feedback on whether or not I should continue placing that order. And it's not necessarily easy for Smart to get at. Well, there's a way for Smart to get at that order, but it's a little bit harder to get at other in-process orders that are essentially only being held in memory at the point that I'm writing them. What makes it even harder, and this is something that's even harder to work around, is that if that application needed to pop itself up to collect more information from me, the clinician, it doesn't have a good way of letting me know when it's done. I have to be responsible for Xing back out and going back to my overall workflow. And so in this particular example, the problems that we're trying to solve is figuring out which current order I'm writing. Again, there are some ways to do this, but we think there are better ways as well. The app needs to know what other orders I've been writing at the same time, even before they're signed. They need to be able to annotate the order that I'm eventually going to place. They want to be able to recommend a new order or substitute one in. And finally, and again, this is probably the hardest part, if it does need to create that user experience, how does it let me know when we're done? And just this is a quick look of how that might look. I've got some scores coming back, but if I wanted to launch out to an application here, the EHR hands off control, and then it's like, well, how do we get that back? And this is where we think that there's an opportunity for integrating those two applications together better. And the method that we've chosen to do that, to prove this concept, is through HTML5 web messaging. The idea is that applications being hosted in two different domains can communicate with each other, a bidirectional communication channel using this window post message. And if we add to that standardized content constraints, we could put together essentially a series of messages that would be approved for those application and the EHR host to talk to each other. So this is how this might look. Let's say that this is my EHR. Over here on the left-hand side, I've opened up Jessica Argonaut's chart, and we're about to start a smart application. So we're about to begin that initiation flow. Usually that would look like this, but there are two important things that have been added there. The first of those is messaging UI.launch activity. There's a scope you might not be familiar with. I'll come back to that one in a second. The second thing is this smart messaging origin parameter, and you notice that that has a URL there. Now we go ahead and launch that application. Everything's fine. And then when that application wants to actually communicate with the EHR, it can use that that window.message format, post message format that's provided by HTML5, and essentially send a message to its parent hosted container. You notice that it's sending that target origin parameter right there. That one came across when we first launched that smart application. If the EHR is going to respond back to that message, again, this is all pretty standard. We've got the response to the message ID there, which allows for some threading, and then a payload that indicates whether or not the message was received and anything that was created out of that message. And we'll talk a little bit about the content of that payload, actually, I believe, now. So using our particular example, let's say that we do indeed want to create, the RADCS app wants to delete the order that's in process. It responds with this message type called Scratchpad delete. We're using the term Scratchpad right now to refer to the container of in-progress orders in the EHR. So different applications and different EHRs may call that different things. You can almost think of it as like a shopping cart of EHRs. This is where the standard content constraints come into play. And so there's a description of what it's trying to do that could be used for auditing. There's the resource, which says, okay, for this service request, the one that you were in the process of writing, the status of draft, I want you to delete it. And the EHR itself would say, yes, okay, I got that. I'm going to go ahead and delete that for you. Again, all of this is done almost in memory. So we're not really hitting the database server here, which makes sense because none of this information has been persisted to the database yet. Let's say that RADCS actually wants to pop up a window and ask the user for more information. There's a slightly different scope that we'd use there, the UI dot. In this case, the message type is UI.done. And it says, OK, RADCS, I am done with my UI. Please take me back to the Scratchpad, that shopping cart of orders. And here's the patient that would be responsible for that. And the EHR says, yes, OK, that makes sense in this context. So two different message types that we're looking at there. One, Scratchpad.something, which refers to the in-process memory type of operations. And the second one, UI.something, which refers to UI interactions that the embedded application states about itself. Now, from an authorization perspective, this is actually pretty straightforward. It's going to use the OAuth 2.0 scopes. In fact, for those Scratchpad type of interactions, we decided to just leave that with a simple patient medication request, for example, .read, that would refer to both persisted medication requests and things that are still in memory, just for simplicity's sake. And then a second scope, the new scope, is that messaging UI.launchActivity or messaging/anything. That's the newer scope that's focused on those UI interactions. Now, we think that this approach has a couple of good advantages to it. Probably the most important is that it does allow for that bidirectional communication. And in a sense, this was really one of the main use cases that I think web messaging was created for in the first place. So we feel like we're taking good use of what standard was already there. Now, there are some drawbacks. Probably the biggest one is still that IE10 drawback, and hopefully we'll just kind of move beyond that and age out of that problem faster than it becomes a problem, but something that we're keeping in mind. We did consider other approaches here, and these slides will be available. This is also all persisted on the GitHub site that I had up there earlier, so if you can feel free to look at that there. Some of the ones that I'll call out is that there are a few options that are good for that communication, but not necessarily for the bidirectional aspect of it. And if you have to essentially initiate polling from the EHR's client to get these messages, well, in that case, you're kind of re-implementing some of the things that HTML5 web messaging gets you. So we thought it would be helpful to take advantage of that. There are some similarities to Firecast, but we think that might be a little bit of overkill for what we're looking at. And a few more other options that were looked at. You could get kind of fancy and give a script snippet that would then be embedded into the EHR. That's a little bit worrisome from a security perspective, so we don't necessarily want to take that path. We did look at SignalR or Socket.io, which would probably be the next best thing for this, but unfortunately it's not standards-based, and we wanted to choose something that would persist and continue to give us some reliability going forward. Now, if you saw those alternatives, you're probably thinking, well, gosh, Janet, that sounds a lot like CDS hooks, and have you considered using CDS hooks? And really, this smart web messaging is being designed to at least have parallels with CDS hooks in many important cases. So for example, those CDS hook suggestions essentially map to the Scratchpad actions. The create suggestion becomes scratchpad.create, update and delete, et cetera. Similarly, the suggestion body that might come in the CDS hooks suggestion, that is essentially recreated in the payload, same as we'd expect there. And there's a proposal right now looking at those activity type launches where the app tells me to return someplace else within the EHR. We're looking at potentially using the hooks themselves within CDS hooks to represent those same concepts within the smart web messaging. I just want to throw a few more examples at you to kind of give you an idea of both how this can be valuable and how it would play out in these other use cases. So to take a slightly different use case, let's say that we have Dr. Slate. And Dr. Slate is using an aid that allows him or her, let's say him for this one, that allows him to be able to answer a series of questions within the DiffDX application. And based on the answers to those questions, the application would then say, you know what, here's the condition that I think should be added to this patient's problem list based on your answers. Now, the reason why the application itself may not want to actually place that and persist it to the database, one good example is just that we might want to have Dr. Slate fill in more details. As it turns out, EHRs aren't always very exact in how they represent even something as simple as a condition. So this allows Dr. Slate to finish completing the problem on the problem list and then persist it to the database on his own based on that suggestion. So this is, again, something similar where we now have this scratchpad.create message type there, a little description that says what we're doing. And this time the resource is populated specifically because this is the resource that is going to be created in that scratchpad or pending or draft type state. In this case, because it was a create action, the EHR itself responds and says, I have now created this new resource. I'm going to call it 123, and here's the resource itself that I created with all of the different FHIR elements filled in there. This one is a little bit longer, my last example of the day, but I think if anything, this one really illustrates some of the power that this can get us and the reasons why we might want applications to be able to take this on. Specifically, I envision the idea of a patient-facing application that's focused on triage. Right? So the patient goes in there, Sunny is our patient. She fills out some questions about her current symptoms. The triage tree goes through everything and it determines, okay, Sunny should come in for a visit within the next week. Now, the type of outcomes that we could have from triage, some sort of triage tool like that, are pretty varied. It might be something like scheduling a visit, which is what I just suggested. It might be, here, wait online so that we can have a video visit right now. It might be, heck, you should come into the emergency room right now. Here's how to let them know that they're coming. Or here's some instructions on how to take care of yourself. And at least those first three different use cases there are ones that patient portals actually do a really good job of doing today. Patient portals are fine at being able to schedule visits or to mark yourself as on the way to the emergency room. And the makers of My Triage might say, gosh, you know, we're mostly a clinical content company that wants to focus on triage. We don't want to implement scheduling. How can we make these two applications work together better? Well, in this particular case, you could say that the My Triage application could say, actually, host, PHR, or patient portal, we want you to launch the slot search activity, which could give a list of all of the available slots for Sunny to schedule into. And maybe here's some constraints on where that would be. Again, this definition of the activity and those activity type parameters are probably the biggest question that we have out there. And then the application returns and says, yes, okay, we already did this, thank you, and we go on about the rest of the workflow. Now, I presented on this in Amsterdam last year, and at that point, it was something that Josh and Isaac and some other folks from Epic, as well as other places, had been just kind of working on and playing around with the idea of, but not necessarily really doing a whole lot with it. And then the Argonauts looked at this and said, you know, that PAMA use case, the one that I described earlier, where we're consulting that appropriate use criteria, that's coming up. We need to find a standards-based way of doing it. Let's find that standards-based way of doing it. And so specifically, an Argonaut Initiative was launched to look at CDS hooks with the PAMA use case and to look at smart web messaging with the PAMA use case as well. And so that was launched in March of 2019 when that first kicked off. Right now, the teams, my hyperlink went away. That was, the birds of a feather at the HTML or at the HL7 Connectathon. That has occurred. Eventually, we'd like to get to the point where we're testing these use cases. There's going to be a Connectathon at the HL7 Working Group meeting in Atlanta this fall. And the hope is that by winter of this year, we can then hand those specs back over to HL7 with all of the questions answered. I don't know if it'll be all of them, but it's a pretty aggressive timeline, and I believe running about a month behind-ish, less than a month. Regardless, that's still really good. Josh doesn't say it all. Isaac says different, so we'll see. But regardless, very far along, and I think it's a really interesting solution to a problem that I'm not sure we necessarily realized we have until we started thinking about it. As I mentioned, though, this is still something that remains with questions with it. And so these are just some of the questions that the team has put together. I would say that the two that I'm thinking is going to be most challenging is figuring out from the app's perspective what message types are suggested, are supported. If you think about it, anything that's associated with content constraints kind of relies on both sides being aware of the content constraints. And so having some sort of a conformance statement where an EHR can say what's supported for messaging types or for activity types will probably be necessary. And similarly, knowing what those message types are that we should focus on, what those activity types are, and what parameters are going to be most important. Those are the things that are likely going to come out of real, actual use cases. So it's good that the PAMA use case came along when it did. So that actually brings me to the end of this presentation. What questions can we answer about what you've just seen? Yes? It's a good question. We know that Cerner has a Scratchpad. Epic has an equivalent of a Scratchpad. We don't call it that. Allscripts has one as well, and I believe Meditech, possibly Meditech. I think in general, this idea of draft documentation that has not yet been persisted to the database is probably just a pretty common one generally. So we think that it will at least start to cover some of the major EHRs out there. Oh, yes. Oh, and I forgot to repeat the question. You guys, it was right up there. You had to remind me to repeat the question. Because this is being recorded, I was answering the question of whether this is supported in the major EHR vendors. Yes?
This may sound a bit dumb question, but I'm curious, even for the draft version of any document, there are situations where physicians or nurses may not be completing the document in one setting. They come out and come out, whatever. In those situations, you still need to persist the draft.
No, so that's a good question. And the question for those, and for the recording was, even though, there are definitely scenarios in which someone may begin an order, need to go do something else, perhaps need to log out. And in those cases, we really do need to persist the documentation. And I think that is true. This doesn't necessarily get rid of this. Or of that need. I think specifically what we're looking at is when you are in the middle of a workflow, you've just finished writing the order and you want to check to see if the order is going to be acceptable. Then at that point, maybe we haven't yet saved that back to the server, or maybe there's other information in memory that hasn't yet been saved back to the server. And since we already kind of needed that UI interaction, it made sense to also look at the in-progress documentation interaction as well. But I agree, there's still definitely a need to save pending documentation to the database server. And so technically this could take advantage of that. And in fact, the pure CDS hooks implementation does take a paradigm, something like that.
Yes? Are you familiar was overly ambitious and tried to solve 1,000 problems. But actually, some of those they found pretty good solutions for. They had a type of a solution for this, as well as a few other things. Not everything they did was a failure. I'm happy with most of it. But some of the things they did were pretty good. And I'm just wondering if that'd be something worth looking at, because if nothing else, at least smart people tried to figure out this problem, even if they failed, and something to be done with that.
No, that's a really good point. Repeating for the recording, the question was about a technology called OpenSocial that apparently was used in a very similar way, embedding a container and then trying to do messaging with its parent container. I wasn't familiar with it. I absolutely agree that it makes sense to look at it and figure out what problems they solved and see if we can replicate some of those same patterns, or maybe if we already have as well. Yes. Sure, great question. How big of a problem is it that this doesn't support mobile native? It's a very good question, and I think a lot of the answers may depend on kind of how that plays out among the EHR vendors and their mobile implementations. There's always the constant battle, right, of do you do a web-embedded type mobile responsive thing so that you only have to code it once, hopefully, or do you go mobile native because it's a better experience? I think this is definitely something that we're aware of. So far, it seems like it's still worth pursuing this at least as proof of concept, just to kind of see, it's partially because from a technical perspective, it's not a super hard lift to do. So we may as well see if we can get further with it. I definitely agree that we will probably need to come up with that answer eventually. Yeah, that's a really good point. So just repeating that, a lot of the hard work here is about modeling those interactions as well as coming up with the message types and the activity types. And that's work that's going to be reproducible regardless of platform, and that's probably the part that's a little bit harder. Yes?
With the assumption that OAuth scopes are approved for all the apps that are in this workflow?
So that's a good question. Is it a reasonable assumption? I don't know if you remember that, but when I was talking about authorization, I mentioned that OAuth scopes, we were using the simple patient / whatever medication, whatever the existing OAuth FHIR scopes for reading and writing and interacting with this draft documentation. The question being, is that actually a good idea? Good question. I think that part of the reason that I think it's okay is because of the point that was made up here earlier, which is that there are already cases in which we're persisting draft documentation to the server already. And so FHIR could have already gotten at that, potentially. I do think that likely what we'll see is that applications and EHRs will need to determine whether or not that's appropriate. But I don't know that we could be in a scenario, and if folks can think of one, I think this would be helpful, where we would want to have a smart embedded application capable of doing certain types of web messaging, but only accessing the non-draft resources. And if that's the case, then we probably would want to put some sort of a draft constraint on those scopes. Yes?
Have you evaluated the security concerns around using this method? It seems like you're opening yourself up to cross-site.
That is a good question, and I'm wondering if Isaac or Josh would want to speak to that question specifically about evaluating the security. Would you like my...
I'd say that the target origin is really like HTML5's like method of restricting web messaging to known and trusted domains, and so I think maybe the more specific question there is, can you hack a smart app launch to pass a fake or non-trustworthy smart messaging origin such that you could kind of capture web messaging traffic? And I don't know. I think to really the real answer to your question is no. We haven't had a formal security assessment, but this is.
One of the examples, I think, had a star, which would open you up.
Oh yeah, agreed. I think yeah. Okay. Yeah, I would say that like.
I just saw that. I was like,
Yeah. Allowing communicating with any like parent container would not be a recommended security best practice for sure. And I think that was probably just an example documentation.
Yeah, I can say with the star in particular, I think I was using that as a wildcard for the purposes of the slide, but not necessarily a wildcard that you'd want to use in production. But a good point about the target origin. One of the things I noticed too there, and I'm not sure if other people picked up on it, but in the example where we navigate back to the Scratchpad from the application, if you noticed, we actually had the patient in there almost as a check, and technically we could use that with the encounter as well to maybe also start to catch and make sure that everyone's on the same thread when it comes to that messaging. I don't know necessarily that we'd require that, but that one also seemed like a good, sanity check for that type of thing. Yes?
This is more of a comment, at least from a security standpoint, you somehow need to make sure that the DOM object in the memory is not accessible to any other plugin or thing that's loaded into the browser memory. Do not have access to that other than
Yeah, so that's a good point. And the point, I don't know why this stopped working. It doesn't work. I believe also the target origin would work there too. So the idea is that when the smart app is invoked, it's going to say, hey, when I'm messaging you, my replies are going to be originating from this place. And so the idea would be then that the EHR, when it gets that information, has the target origin parameter there. Now, with the target origin parameter, that actually is an area where I believe you can do either a wildcard or just leave it blank, which would definitely not be recommended because then you absolutely would open yourself up to that. Yes?
Are there any thoughts given to maintaining patient and provider context similar to CCAL bidirectional?
Yeah, so the question was, is there any thought to maintaining sort of the patient and provider context prior to CCAO? I would say that my understanding is that a lot of that has been taken up by the Firecast effort that I mentioned, and that a lot of what they've been focused on is having that same sort of integration and context across even non-embedded applications. One thing that we were looking at, and I didn't mention this, but it kind of leads me to it, was that this potentially could also be a way that the client the embedded application could maintain state and store state back to the EHR that embedded it. So if we were ever interrupted in the middle of that workflow and had to, close everything down, that we could recreate back with some sort of a state parameter that's shared between the two. Other questions? So one more thing that I'll highlight for anyone who's interested in this, Dennis from Cerner was showing me the CDS Hook Sandbox, yes? Okay, now has some prototype implementations of this, so if you would like to try it out, I'm sure he'll show you how to do it, but please take a look at that as well. And if you see down there at the bottom, that bit.ly/smart messaging is where you can find all of this information and everything else that's been going into this. Thank you so much for coming, and I and some of the others will be up here if anybody else thinks of any last-minute questions. Thank you.